talk to suggest that Protestants, that William Hendrickson accepts the papacy. I assumed, I was being dishonest, that you would understand that when I said Hendrickson was a world-class Reformed biblical scholar. My point is that he acknowledges the premises of the Catholic position. And I'm suggesting that there is a reluctance on the part of scholars who are honest in admitting some of the premises to draw the necessary and irresistible conclusion because of prejudices which we all bring to our reading of the text. We need to be aware of that fact when we read the Bible. As I listened to Mr. White's reasons for rejecting the Catholic understanding of these passages, I found them quite flawed. I especially take strong exception as a biblical scholar to Mr. White's misrepresenting the whole situation of the Aramaic. I hope that Mr. White is not saying that Jesus was actually speaking Greek to Peter at this particular point. The evidence is that Jesus and the apostles, of course, as Palestinian Jews, were speaking Aramaic to each other. And I also object to Mr. White saying, which shows either ignorance of the information on his part or a deliberate attempt to mislead the audience, that some Catholic apologists go so far, were his words, as to strain for the position that it was originally written in Aramaic. That is not a view of a Roman Catholic apologists straining to come up with some desperate measure. The statement that Matthew wrote his gospel in Aramaic is the universal consensus of every single church father who comments upon the authorship of Matthew's gospel and the language in which it was written. I would ask Mr. White to make good his insinuation by citing one example of a church father who said Matthew did not write in Aramaic. He wrote it only and always in Greek. And he made much hay of the fact that we don't have this original Aramaic. Well, I would say the same to Mr. White. Mr. White, please play fair with the audience. Do we have the original Greek either? No, we don't. You have no more evidence in terms of producing the autographs that the original was written in Greek of Matthew's gospel than you have than you would argue that I have for the statement that it was written originally in Aramaic. The point is simply that Jesus, in saying to Peter, "You are Kepha, and on this Kepha I will build my church," shows that there is one rock in view and not two. That Mr. White's whole argument about Petros and Petra, which simply indicates a difference of gender, falls to the ground. To further, after indicting the Catholic with being speculative, to say, well, if Jesus was speaking Aramaic, he would have probably used the word minra, where I'm not aware of any scholar who argues in any commentary that this is what Jesus would have called Peter. You are minra. And the fact is, it flies in the face of the Bible we have. Folks, if that's the case, Mr. White, why is it that there are no places in the Bible where Simon is given the new name Minra? He's called Kepha. Paul, whom you said does not recognize this special status that Catholics accord to Peter, calls him Cephas over and over again. He calls him rock. And the point of the Catholic position is that Peter is given this foundational role. And the rock in and of itself doesn't prove that it has successors. You have to build. I'm building a case here step by step. And all I ask, please, of both Mr. White and of myself and of you, is that you listen honestly and carefully and say, is this point substantiable? And then, what next point can be built upon it? Is it the case, first of all, that there is this special prominence shown to Peter in the Gospels and the Acts? Mr. White didn't deal with any of that data. He had no way of accounting for the fact that Peter is mentioned more than any other apostle, except for the fact that he's an impetuous fellow, and he speaks without thinking all the time. I agree. The Catholic Church doesn't deny that. That's the very point, you see, that it is not Peter's human strength that qualifies him for this office, but this special gift that God gives him. Certainly he speaks without thinking on the Mount of Transfiguration. Certainly he does immediately after Jesus receives this special confession from him and gives him all these blessings. And he says, "No, Lord, I don't want you to have to be crucified." But Mr. White, I hope, is not misrepresenting the Catholic position. The Catholic position is not that the Pope is infallible every time he speaks, that the Holy Spirit speaks through him on every off-the-cuff remark or on every occasion. If Mr. White is trying to mislead you into thinking that, then he is really not engaging in the debate. He's here to debate the Roman Catholic position, not a caricature of it or a straw man. He said that Paul never refers to Peter as Pope. but he refers to him as rock, as I said. He said that Peter simply refers to the other bishops as my fellow elders. Matter of fact, most Protestant commentaries, if you do a survey of them, will indicate that what the Greek word there actually means, if you look at the syntax of the structure of that sentence, is that Peter is saying, I am a fellow priest and fellow priest with Christ and witness of his sufferings. But even if he is saying, I'm a fellow elder with you, that doesn't mean that Peter doesn't have a preeminent position any more than when Richard Nixon said, my fellow Americans. He was saying, I'm not your president. I don't have any extra authority that you don't possess too. You can come up and run the country as well. Of course they're fellow bishops. Of course they're fellow elders. And yet Peter, it does not deny that he has a preeminence. He says that, Jesus says the greatest must be the servant of all. The Catholic Church admits that the whole attitude of the servants of God should be precisely that. The Pope's greatest title, perhaps, is servant of the servants of God. He says, Peter doesn't speak like a Pope. I have to assume that Mr. White hasn't read any of the encyclicals of this current Pope, John Paul II, if he says that, because this Pope and many popes have spoken with great tenderness and with great humility, and they don't lord it over. I mean, just because a father might plead with his children instead of just tyrannizing over them or laying down the law, or might be very tender and compassionate with his wife rather than simply ordering her about, doesn't mean that he doesn't have a headship in the home, folks. Now, Christ is the head of every home, but St. Paul says that the husband exercises one under Christ. And in the same way, the church, as the household of faith, has a headship. Christ's headship doesn't make all other headships impossible.
Time.
Okay. Mine must be out of sync.
There's 7 minutes.
There were, in Mr. Matic's comments, so many misrepresentations of what I had said that I hope you will fill out that piece of paper, you'll get the tapes and listen to what I actually said. I'm the only one who has cited the official statements of Rome in regards to the doctrine of the papacy. That has not been done by anyone else, so there's obviously no intention upon my part to misrepresent or mislead anyone. I'd like to just throw out some things for your consideration. John was the first one to believe at the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Remember, Peter doubted. He didn't believe. John is called the beloved disciple, the one who Jesus Christ loved. John records, the only one who's given the ability to record the last night of ministry, the Lord with his disciples in John chapter 13 and following. John receives the revelation at the end of time. He's the last of the apostles to die. Would that be basis for believing that John has primacy in the Christian church? Or what about Paul? Paul's caught up to the third heaven. Paul is the only one to see Christ after the ascension. Paul writes at least 13 of the New Testament books. Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul has the vision that instructs him to go into Macedonia. He receives supernatural